Everyone. We are community engagement students from Professor Corwin's class, and throughout the semester we've been attending events related to intersections of gender, race, and other forms of identity. And today we're all going to help facilitate this program. We also have two special guests, Wanda Johnson and Cynthia Peterson, but they haven't arrived yet, looks like. And today we're just going to begin by introducing the topics of perceptions, victim blaming, and intersectionality. We'll then talk about perceptions in their relationship to racial profiling and a lack of understanding surrounding sexual assault. We're going to engage our speakers in a dialogue about these topics and finally explore the concept of allyship and talk about what we can all do to get beyond stereotypes and move towards collective understanding. I wanted to briefly just mention a few topics that we've focused on within our anthropology coming of age in the US class. One that was really interesting was the perception of displaying affect in the courtroom as a justification for being a victim of trauma. And we actually had the author of this reading, Hannah Manchel, come and speak to us. And she really talks about advocating for the removal of emotional testimony when it comes to sexual assault, because through decentering the self, she argues we can pay more attention to the evidence of a patterned social disease that needs to be addressed as a collective instead of a personal problem. We found that really interesting. We've also discussed how knowledge and truth are produced through structures of power, meaning that people in power are positioned to shape what is understood as a social truth, and they define knowledge based on what we learn in institutions. We've also talked about how ethnic and cultural background, class, language, religion, sexuality, they all provide different levels of privilege or disadvantage. Welcome, Wanda, hear that you've arrived. And Black women, for example, can experience discrimination at the junction of race and gender, which leaves them vulnerable to racialized sexual violence. So an intersectional lens is really necessary in order to look at how injustice impacts different people based on their identities. And yeah, I think we can start the presentation if you want, Imelda.
I'm gonna actually share it.
Okay.
Yeah, give me 1 second.
No worries. We're just going to introduce our guest speakers next.
Okay, can you see this? Okay, cool. And then,
yeah. And you can go to the speakers.
Okay,
the next
sorry.
slide.
I'm just trying to figure out how to go to, oh, okay, there we go. Go ahead.
Yeah, so we're really excited to welcome you two today. I'm going to introduce Wanda Johnson. After losing her son, Oscar Grant, at the hands of BART police in 2009, Wanda Johnson dedicated her life to advocating for a more just world that is free of racism, racial profiling, and police brutality. And this year, Wanda Johnson is the social justice practitioner in residence for the Center for Women and Gender Equity, and as well as the executive director of the Oscar Grant Foundation. And she's going to be leading and facilitating monthly workshops on how to effectively make our voices heard in our quest for a world that is free of racism, sexism, and oppression. So welcome, Wanda. We're excited to talk to you. And Cynthia Peterson is the executive director of Community Violence Solutions, and she has dedicated her entire professional career to advocating for victims of sexual assault, overseeing outreach and education to work towards reducing sexual assault cases. And Cynthia says humbly that what keeps her going is the knowledge that there's a need and that she has the capacity to advocate for change. So happy to welcome you. And then we have Sharon, the director of the center, who will be here to offer some context and comments around the intersectional nature of these issues and just to help moderate in general. And Megan, who introduced herself earlier, but who's the director of care, and she's going to be here to talk about victim blaming culture and how it is particularly relevant on a college campus.
Yeah, so first off, we want to talk about intersectional relevance when it comes to perceptions. what is intersectionality and why is it important? So intersectionality is the interconnected nature of social categorizations and identities such as race, class, gender, disabilities, and sexuality. These social categories create overlapping systems of discrimination and disadvantage in our society. And intersectionality acknowledges that everyone has their own unique experiences with discrimination and oppression. So why is it relevant in terms of perceptions? Without an intersectional lens, efforts towards tackling these structures of inequalities might end up perpetuating the same systems we want to tackle. So it's a vital framework when analyzing cultural perceptions we see within our own society. So perceptions. So we just want to take a moment to think about a couple of questions. What perceptions do you have? What does perceptions mean to you? What do other people perceive about you? And if you all want to take a second to unmute yourselves or maybe answer in the chat, feel free to do so, or just take a moment to reflect about the perceptions that you hold about others and yourselves.
I think that sometimes with perceptions also comes like stereotypes and like making sure that you know like the difference, and they can be like negative stereotypes, and making sure that your perception of like the world doesn't include like negative stereotypes is important.
Thank you for sharing.
I guess a perception I have about like athletes, I guess, is that they are like gym rats. They care about their body, and they they work out a lot, or like care about what they eat. It's like something like that.
Okay, thank you all for sharing.
So, how can perceptions connect to victim blaming? Victim blaming is the attitude which suggests that the victim, rather than the perpetrator, bears responsibility for the assault. Tips on how to avoid interpersonal victim blaming is make sure the survivor feels comfortable and in control. Remember that telling their story can be extremely triggering. Give the survivor time that they need. Inform the survivor of their options and appropriate resources. And understand that the part of the brain's response to trauma is to block out certain memories. And also remember to take care of your own emotional well-being.
All right, so I'm just gonna share a little about some racial profiling facts that I've found from this website, or we got from this website, ACLU, which is very helpful. We rely on the police to protect us from harm and promote fairness and justice in our communities, but racial profiling has led countless people in fear, casting entire communities as suspects simply because of what they look like and where they come from or what religion they adhere to. More than 200 years of slavery and 90 years of legalized racial segregation has led to systemic profiling of Blacks at traffic stops and pedestrian stops. Yeah, Sharon, you wanted to jump in?
I'm so sorry. I wanted to take a quick minute right after the intersectionality slide just to kind of, I apologize, Max, I couldn't quite catch you before you began. But I just wanted to spend a quick minute contextualizing for folks about the importance of this topic at this particular moment. And I want to thank the community engagement students, SCAR, the Center for Women and Gender Equity team, and also the Care Center for being a part of this collective. And also Wanda Johnson, who's here. I think Cynthia Peterson will join us after a minute, hopefully. But I wanted to just pause here. We had this, like, Wanda and I started thinking about this particular idea of perceptions and our need to talk about it and our need to think about how they relate to victim blaming culture. It came up in the fall when we were talking about some of the ways in which people become, like in George Floyd's case, for example, some people blame he's deceased and yet people are blaming him for his death. And we sometimes use, or people have perceptions which can tie into stereotypes, and it has a racial context. And the same victim blaming culture we see, it's also very present in sexual assault. And so I wanted to kind of contextualize it. And I also wanted to I didn't want to go too far into this program without taking a minute to really underscore the gravity of this moment in time. I don't think that we expected that we'd have a verdict the day before this program. And yet we continue to do this work from a very intersectional lens. And I think this is important. And this is an opportunity for us to look at the complexity of perceptions and victim blaming as they pertain to people from all walks of life who are impacted by different types of violence. And I'm sorry, Max, I meant to start this before you started talking about racial profiling, but I just wanted to interject the context for people before we got further into it. So if you even wanted to do a quick recap on what you started on, feel free.
Sharon, can I say something for a minute?
Please, please,
can you just
be with us?
Oh, you're welcome. Can you just back up to the slide right before this? Because I really want to say something about the slide, victim blaming. It's so important when a couple is together and they're facing where the one is getting abused by the other one. There are times when the person who is the abuser blames the victim, saying to the victim, you made me do that. So if you're ever in an abusive relationship, oftentimes victim blaming is one of the things that occurs so frequently, and it makes the one who's being abused feel like they deserve what is happening to them. They begin to say, well, maybe if I would have had the dinner cooked, or maybe if I would have washed the clothes better, or they begin to blame themselves as well as the person who is the abuser begins to blame them. And so I wanted to kind of just talk about that real quick, because oftentimes when that happens, even as children, when people begin to blame the child for, could be stealing, could be lying, and maybe the child was telling the truth, or maybe the child wasn't stealing, and somebody keeps victim blaming that child, they grow up with that same feeling that other people are going to blame them for what they have been blamed for continually as growing up. And it often stays with them. And so that's why it's so important that we understand that life and death is in the power of the tongue. And when we blame people for things, and this victim blaming, it really does something internally to people, to those that are being abused, to those that are being blamed for things that they may not have done. And so our perception and connecting to victim blaming is so very important for us to really evaluate ourselves and make sure that we're not blaming others for things that we may have failed in or things that we may have done. and as we really examine ourselves, and if we find out that we are doing the victim blaming and that we are really the perpetrator in that area, we need to really reevaluate that. And if we need counseling, get the counseling. If we need to talk to someone, or if we need to get away because of, we're in a dangerous situation, then we need to really work to do that.
Wanda, I appreciate you having us come back and spend some extra time on this slide and you talking about this from really a relationship context. And I think that everybody in this group can also see the ways in which victim blaming is playing out maybe in social media. If so-and-so wasn't in that place, and if he wasn't doing that thing, if he would have just listened, like we're seeing kind of the same logic that's applied to victims of relationship abuse or sexual abuse. In some cases, people are using that same kind of victim blaming mentality with victims of police violence. So I think it's very important, and I love that we spent a little bit of extra time on this.
Yeah, and absolutely. If you go back to that next slide, I'm sorry, I'm taking over, but if you go to the next slide where it's the racial profiling, and you think about the perception, you can understand that when Oscar was killed, there was a lot of victim blaming, meaning that they began to demonize Oscar, sort of like what they did with George Floyd. They began to basically blame him for his own death. If he wouldn't have used drugs, if he wouldn't have resisted, if he would have just followed directions, if he wouldn't have had the fake $20 bill and took it in there, then he wouldn't have died. But so we, going back to the racial profiling and looking at blaming the victim, it is the 240 years of blaming, 90 years of legalized blaming. And you got to go back to looking at how the police force or policing was set up, and understanding that it was a control mechanism, and it was used to control slaves and to blame them for running away from their masters and then trying to capture them and taking them back, and then whooping them and beating them for their disobedience. And it's all a part of blaming the victim for what they've done or what they feel that the perpetrator believes that the victim shouldn't have done.
Thank you, Max. We took you off a little bit, but we'll give you back the floor to set up the context before you turn it back around and ask questions, okay?
Yeah, thank you, Wanda. You brought it back to victim blaming perfectly, so I actually appreciate that. So thank you so much. And I think that wrapped up what I was going to talk about. I think we're ready to talk about misperceptions about sexual assault.
Okay, sorry, I was trying to unmute. Yeah, so another area that we wanted to focus on was sexual assault. And so we wanted to share some misconceptions around sexual assault. So some examples are that sexual assault is committed by strangers and that it can't happen to men, and that sexual assault can't happen to me. It only happens to people who do certain things. And then lastly, that people think that victims of sexual assault should and like always report what happens to them. So in reality, only about 80% of survivors know the person that assaulted them, and that men can also be victims. Women are not the only people that are victim to sexual assault. And 95% of sexual assaults go unreported. It is important that the survivor has a role in deciding whether or not they want to report what happens. And then lastly, sexual assault impacts people of all backgrounds. It is never the fault of the victim. So also some examples of victim blaming. when a sexual assault case is brought to light is that people will ask questions such as, well, what was that person wearing? Or why was that person at that party? Or other examples are like, well, that person was okay with that in the past, so they must have been okay with it then as well. And one of the most common phrases was, well, they were asking for it. So these are all common phrases and questions that are said when a sexual assault case is brought into light. And it's really important that we help the survivor feel empowered and that it's not their fault. So I was wondering if Wanda, or I don't know if Cynthia's here yet, if any of our guest speakers wanted to share their thoughts.
This part is for Megan.
Oh, Megan, sorry, yes, go ahead.
No problem. Sure. There's many reasons why folks would choose not to report. And that can be related to personal preferences, shame, related to the traumatic experience, unsure about what they want to do at that certain time. And we really encourage survivors to make the choice about reporting what's going to work best for them, and encourage the survivor to know that they're in the driver's seat in terms of reporting, and if they want to or not. One piece of my role as a confidential resource on campus is to help students kind of tease out if they may or may not want to report, and kind of talk through some of those reasons why that may or may not be their choice. Thanks.
And some of the victims are scared to actually report it. Some fear that, maybe the person has threatened them in some kind of way. And so they become fearful to report it. And so they won't report it. They'll endure the assault continually because of that fear. And I haven't met Megan yet, but I'm sure because she's on campus that, there's always someone there on the campus herself to talk to, or probably maybe a number to dial if, something like that is occurring on campus and you're fearful to talk about what's going on. And I'm sure they have a confidentiality clause where, they will work through the issue, with keeping it as confident as they can keep it,
Absolutely. And thank you, Wanda, for kind of alluding to that as well. One of the reasons that my position is confidential is that very reason. If someone doesn't want to report and may have fear around that or fear of retaliation, many different reasons, we want to be able to offer that individual the resources and support, whether they choose to actually report it or not, if that makes sense. And so that's why a position like mine and a few others on campus are carved out that way. And we do have a 24/7 care line available, and that's staffed by staff and faculty. And I'll pop that in in the chat as well.
Great, thank you, Wanda and Megan.
Welcome.
All right, now, after coming through the presentation, we're going to move on to the discussion part of our night with our panelists who are with us here. So our first question for any one of our guests is, how have you observed victim blaming culture in your work and or in your life?
Wanda, I volunteer you. Do you want to go first?
No problem. I think I've been talking a lot, but that's no problem. So how have I observed victim blaming in culture in my work in my life? So in my life, when my son Oscar was killed, a lot of blame was going on that he should have never been out on New Year's, that he should have been home with his family. And I thought about that and I said, wow, it's a holiday. You should be able to go out and enjoy yourself. And of course, the story is he lost his life. But I think victim blaming had really hit me very hard when my son died, because even one of the attorneys said that he caused his own death, instead of them taking the responsibility that my son had been killed by someone who is supposed to serve the community. It was switched to blaming it on himself. And I had to deal with my own internal victim blaming. I, for a while, began to try to blame myself for my son being killed, because I said, I'm the one who instructed him to take BART. And so he took BART, and then he lost his life. So I began to blame myself. And so when we think about victim blaming, not only, do sometimes the perpetrator try to cause you to feel like it's your fault. Sometimes we internally do it ourselves to try to make it feel like it's our fault, when it's really out of our control or really not our fault.
Thank you, Wanda. And another question we had tonight is,
I think there's enough room for probably Megan and I to hop in. Cynthia has not arrived yet, has she?
oh, I haven't seen her yet, no.
Okay. So I was just gonna build on something that Wanda was saying today, because I found myself, actually Wanda and I were texting a little bit even during this conversation, and I actually posted something today on my Facebook page, kind of giving a montage of different cases related to police violence that I have covered over the past decade, with a message like, as we celebrate this victory about somebody being held accountable, let's also remember all those people who've been fighting for this issue for so many years. And there were some people were very supportive, and then there were some really kind of nasty comments that got on there with things that are very much like what you said, Wanda. People said that Oscar caused his own death. We know that's not true. And I saw people blaming the deceased for their death, and then kind of explaining away each of the things. And I said, well, this is textbook victim blaming. We could see this. You're blaming the deceased for their death. We blame, just as we blame victims of sexual assault or gender-based violence for their abuse. And it just really does show up. And some of the kind of white supremacist ideologies also really do, they also connect to patriarchy. So that's why it's interesting that sometimes we don't realize how interconnected these issues are. So I guess I just wanted to add that. And I think it'd be great if, Megan, you wanted to talk about, from your role, if you wanted to add how you see this issue.
Absolutely. When I work with survivors, I often hear them trying to sort out some of the victim blaming that has come their way. Trying to wrestle with, my mom said, why didn't you stop it? Or my roommate said, you really shouldn't have been drinking. And they're trying to kind of wrestle and understand that. And what we know psychologically is that victim blaming is damaging, right? It is a loss of control for the individual, increases their sense of vulnerability, and it certainly can increase risks related to depression, PTSD, anxiety. And it is so prevalent in our culture. And so, one thing that we can really do and take action on is notice if there's victim blaming around us, and educate around that. And that's something that I would do in a session with a survivor. I would explain, I'm hearing some victim blaming. Let me explain what that is. In a lot of times, a survivor may kind of see how it is when I share that perspective, if that's something that they're interested in exploring. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sharon, Wanda, and Megan. We're going to move on to our next question, which is, how can that culture of victim blaming relate to sexual assault victims and victims of racial profiling?
I feel like we've kind of been speaking about this topic. Do either of you have anything more to add, or else we can also move on toward one of the other questions too?
Nothing else to add for me.
Me neither.
Okay, perfect. Let's go on to the third one, which is how do perceptions relate to stereotypes?
And I even think that we're getting into this one as well, or that I think that we've all been very verbose with our answers, so we're kind of answering more than the question in front of us. So sorry for that, and maybe it'll allow us to have brevity here and move towards something, but it feels like the simple answer is in every way. If we have a perception and we are operating out of that perception, ultimately it can become a stereotype, right? So you gave some statistics around racial profiling. Maybe somebody has a perception that causes certain people to be pulled over at a higher rate, right? Megan gave some examples about how certain people are treated a certain way when they want to come forward or don't want to come forward, or when they end up to be victims. So my simple answer is every way, and I want to pivot to either of the other guests. And then I think once we get to question 4, I imagine that we'll have a lot of room. I imagine that Wanda has a lot to say about that one.
Sure, let's move on to question 4, which is how do the perceptions which relate to stereotypes, even how do the stereotypes impact the criminal justice system?
So, I always talk about racism. I talk about how it is not something that you're born with, but it's a taught behavior. And so for many years, and even today, it's since the beginning of time, we have come where it's easy to blame others for the true way that we feel about a situation. And so it's easier to blame society, or it's easier for society to blame you for the way you act or the things that you're doing. When we look at the impact of the criminal justice system and we talk about that, we can look at how the system was built and how it has impacted certain groups of people more than the others. And we always try to say, well, because that group of people, African Americans or Hispanics, do more killing, more stealing, more this and more that. And so because of that, many people perception believe that, and then they act upon that. And that's the same oftentimes with policing, because of oftentimes what police have heard when they go into different communities to police, they go in with the mindset of what they heard, but not really knowing the victims that are there. And so it's easier to blame them for what's going on than really blame yourself by saying, maybe I'm not looking at this situation fairly because I'm coming from a perception of how I heard this group of people act versus how this group of people really is.
Megan or Sharon?
Do you want to add anything, Megan?
Sure. I think also too, in our criminal justice system, there can be this stereotype or perception, particularly around interpersonal violence or sexual assault, that it is someone not acquainted with the survivor. it couldn't be a spouse or a partner or something along those lines, some of those perceptions and stereotypes. And that can also impact the criminal justice system in that regard as well, in terms of kind of just a misunderstanding about who could be a perpetrator.
And I feel like I've spoken a lot, and I want to leave some room for some of the things that I have for the end. And so feel free to skip me for this one and move on, George.
Sure. Do you mean skip you or skip question 5?
No, I mean, I won't add anything to this one. I would say I think it would be appropriate to give space to talk about question 5, given it being Sexual Assault Awareness Month.
Right, then I'll head on in. All right. So what is consent, and in what context is it applicable? And when do we get mixed messages about it?
I'm happy to kick that one off. So starting with the mixed messages, if you think back to either favorite movies or TV programs, you often don't get that message of affirmative consent that we work so hard to educate on. You often don't see that. So the mixed messages, can come through someone's whole developmental cycle where they're not really seeing that moment of consent, or they're not learning about it so much. What is consent? Consent is something that is freely given. It is active. It can be retracted at any time. We, of course, like to say that it is more of the yes means yes. It's an enthusiastic and affirming type of consent. And in all contexts, it would be applicable, and we want to get consent in all different ways. If it's digitally, you want to ask for consent. If it's in person, ask for consent. But really take those extra steps to get that consent. And you want it to be enthusiastic, right? I always like to give the example of a stoplight. If you can picture kind of the yellow, green, and red light, you want green. You do not want that yellow. And naturally, you don't want red, but oftentimes you may want to ask yourself, am I in the yellow? And what steps do you need to do to be in that green, affirmative, enthusiastic consent area? Wanda, do you have anything to add?
So, one of the things that I was thinking about as you were speaking, I don't know if you ever or remember the story regarding Mike Tyson and Robin Givens. And I was thinking about that because we've been talking about sexual assault and different things in the victim blaming. And so I thought about how when she said she was raped by Mike Tyson, how people begin to kind of blame her for it happening. I remember how one of the things they talked about, how she went over to his house early morning, I think it was like 2 in the morning or 3 in the morning, and how many people was talking about how she didn't go to watch TV. There was really nothing on. She must have knew that he would want to have sex with her. And so it was her fault for being there. And so I thought about that, when you think about consent, giving the okay to do something. And she was saying no, that she wasn't given the okay, even though she was there. And so it could have been a mixed message for him, but it didn't matter because no means no. And that's what, has to be very clear, that even if you're in that kind of situation as a man with a woman, when the woman says no or the man says no, it means no, and they're not giving their consent. And so that's when, rape can occur. And then also victim blaming starts to occur because the assaulter could say, well, you was over my house at 2 o'clock in the morning. What did you think was going to happen? It's your fault for coming over. You knew what we were going to do. And so they start blaming blaming the person who has been assaulted. And so I think it's so important that we give clear messages so that situations like that doesn't occur. And so when we give the clear message, we also have to, make sure that we know where we're at and where we're going and what can be perceived as a mixed message, when we face those kind of situations.
And I was just going to add one more thing, because a place where consent, because of the intersectional nature of this program and discussion, I think we want consent, and we want to have informed consent about everything that we do. So remember, consent applies to everything, right? Are we going along with an activity, or are we showing that we're okay with something by virtue of not challenging it? Like, there's that type of kind of implied consent that can happen in a social context where maybe we passively don't challenge something, or we might be a bystander. We'll talk about that in a minute. Or are we getting coerced into doing something that we don't want to, whether it be going to a movie when we didn't want to, or something else, right? This can come up in many contexts, and sometimes we might ask clarifying questions. And I'm bringing up this nuanced topic in this context because I'm thinking about the other thing that's heavy on hearts right now and minds is police interactions with people. And we've seen incidents where people are saying, wait a minute, what's going on? Why am I being pulled over? Can you give me more information? And obviously there's a power differential, but there's a perception around that, right? There's a perception around by virtue of being ordered to do something, you just automatically need to do it, or else whatever will happen would be justified. And of course, there's a big movement to challenge that, but it's messy even to try to explain it. But I just want to kind of acknowledge that that's another complicated strand of this conversation.
That's why I think, when we talk about perception, being clear, it really requires, us as humans to be clear and really have the boundaries of what we define in our lives is acceptable or unacceptable, and not to allow others to make us feel like we deserve the unacceptable behavior of someone else, or the unacceptable words, or whatever may be unacceptable. That we have to know that our boundaries are clear and not to accept those things. It's just like, as Sharon was talking about policing, I believe it was in Virginia, where the sergeant of the Army was driving. He was pulled over, but he kept driving until he was in a lighted area, and he immediately put his hands out the window. Why am I being pulled over? What are you stopping me for? And he was questioning the officer, and he ended up getting pepper sprayed. But he did not fall into the fact of, okay, well, maybe I did do something wrong, but he stood and firm on knowing that, what are you stopping me for? He didn't change that thought process. And I'm saying that to say, because not only in those type situations, but in other situations, there are times when we find ourselves changing our thought process and allowing ourselves to accept the blame put on us and carrying that, when in fact it is not your fault at all.
Thanks, Wanda.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much, Wanda and Sharon. So our last question here on this slide is, how can we be allies and advocate for positive change?
Okay, if it's okay, I will jump in, and you can even go to probably the next slide. Is that the one about allyship? Just keeping track here. Yeah. So interestingly, I was just talking about this with a group of people before. So many of you might know that Megan Gallagher she's the director of the care center. She's my awesome colleague. She oversees the sexual assault, the care line. Sorry, I was going to give you the old line, refer to it in its old acronym. And she also leads the Green Dot program on campus. But as we talked about intersectionality with everything in this space, I've been thinking about this a lot. So in an interpersonal relationship context, we talk about the 3 Ds in terms of distract, direct, delegate. So that might look like if you see something happening in an interpersonal context, you could say, oh, excuse me, sir, could you, or ma'am, can you take a picture for me? You just kind of do something to get in the way. Direct might be saying, can you stop? I'm not comfortable with that. Delegate might mean asking for help. Right before this meeting, I was in another meeting where people were holding space to talk about kind of this moment that we're at in history, with former officer Derek Chauvin being held accountable. And I was really thinking about the role that bystanders play with everything, and the way that we can apply these Ds, not only to interpersonal violence as it relates to gender-based violence or interpersonal violence, but also to racism and other things. So for example, I have to put my glasses on because I'm looking at something here, trying to read. So I just wanted to light up in this context. I wanted to mention some important bystanders that we just saw that made a difference and kind of show the applicability of the Ds. And I actually think there's 4 Ds that I'm going to talk about. I would add on a 4th. That's not Green Dot approved, but that's my own addition. But so we know that there's an 18-year-old woman named Darnella Frazier and a 9-year-old girl named Judea Reynolds. Those 2 had gone to the grocery store together, and they didn't feel right about what they were seeing. So they documented the incident that was happening with the cell phone. Then we had a community member named Charles Mcmillan, a 61-year-old man from the community who felt really uncomfortable with what he was seeing. He tried to speak with George Floyd, trying to comfort him a little bit, trying to calm him down because he was panicking. And he also pled with the officers, can you please stop, leave him alone? He tried to speak directly to them. So he used that strategy. One thing to emphasize about the Ds is you always do what is safe. So none of these people went and directly touched or physically got involved. They just used their voices and their tools. An off-duty firefighter named Genevieve Hansen offered CPR, and when they said no, she offered to teach them or walk them through it. So she tried also to help. And then there was a martial artist named Donald Williams, and he used the tactic of delegating. So he delegated, he called the police to ask for help and to say, I'm not comfortable with what I'm seeing. And they all had that feeling in their gut where they had to do something. And I mean, we can look at this in a number of ways. And in one way, I know that because these people have said they're all struggling with trauma and a feeling of defeat because they couldn't save this man. On another level, though, somebody is being held accountable, and that's not something that we see every day. And so all of these bystanders played a role in that regard. And bystanders also can play a role in many other contexts. I wonder if Wanda or Megan want to add anything to this.
Just to add to the concepts of allyship in some of the pieces of this is, it doesn't have to be a moving mountains type of allyship, right? A program like this is big and wonderful and educational, but it can even be those small moments where you speak up and say something. or you give someone a second look or ask them maybe what they mean, can be those small moments of allyship. So I would encourage anyone on this call to think about tonight, tomorrow morning, what you can do. If we all work together and add up those small moments, that is when our culture, can shift, along with bigger, robust programs like this, of course.
Yeah, so important, right? Like challenge a joke, don't laugh at it. Say you feel uncomfortable. Sometimes we kind of pass it. We don't challenge people because we don't want, like, sometimes we're programmed to be people pleasers and we might feel uncomfortable to do something that might draw attention to something. But I think what Megan is saying is so important, to think about all the tiny little things. We probably have enough. Wanda, do you want to add anything?
No, I was just listening to Megan, and it is, important to, as you shared the examples of those watching George Floyd being killed, it's important, for, us to, be there if we, direct and we see something, someone touching a person the wrong way, that, you share that, with Megan, or, you kind of talk to that person, if you're friends with that person, if that person may feel uncomfortable. It's important, so to be direct, I don't like that. Don't do that to me. Don't touch me there. And it's okay to be direct, and it's also okay to, hey, to share that with someone, that you are feeling uncomfortable about a situation, you're feeling uncomfortable, at the store, that person is, following you around the store, or whatever it may be. As you be direct about it, don't ever feel like you have to blame yourself for what is occurring, because it is not your fault, and you have the voice to say something about it, especially when you don't like what's occurring.
That's awesome. And then, like, Wanda's really amplifying the direct and clear, like the methodology of being direct and clear. But remember, like, there's also the other things. If your comfort and safety doesn't feel good, there's also the other D's you can rely on, right? You can find your entry point wherever it is. That's what's beautiful about it. I wonder, I know we're running short on time here, but could I invite everybody to put something in the chat that they're going to commit to doing for allyship, and maybe one of the CE students can kind of amplify them or read some of the things that pop up. And then we'd also, of course, love to, we can, are there any, if there's no more slides, we can move to the gallery view, and then it would be great to take a picture of all of us. Oh, there is an important slide.
Yeah, this is our big last slide. So here on campus, we have a number of resources surrounding sexual assault. You can find all these online at the St. Mary's web pages, and in Augustine Hall, which is across from Student Disability Services, and the classrooms by Philippi Academic Hall, which is by the Rec Center, which is the Campus Assault and Education. We have Student Coalition Against Rape and Abuse, which is SCAR, and CAPS, which is Counseling and Psychological Services, the Center for Women and Gender Equity, the CWGE, which is what we're a part of through our community engagement, all the scale speakers here. And one of the most important in the past year, the Health and Wellness Center. And they're all, once again, in Augustine Hall. And they're there to help you if you want to turn to them, or even just ask them about how you'd like to get involved.
Okay, can I invite, so I will invite you to stop the screen share, and let's all go ahead and enter some level of one thing that we're going to do to be allies. Megan and I put some things down, but we would really love to hear. Oh, okay. I see some more stuff popping up. Does somebody want to read these, or do you want one of us to do it? It'd be more fun if one of you all wanted to do it.
I could read them.
Thanks.
Do you want me to say the names, or should I just read the?
I think just the ideas are fine.
All right. Challenge stereotypes. Listen. Make space for other voices to be heard. Challenge others. Speak up when I see something that doesn't look right. Challenge inappropriate jokes. Continue to rethink my initial reactions. Practice listening to others and using one of the 3Ds we needed, or when needed. By not being a bystander in all types of contexts and situations. Connect and engage with these topics with my friends and other time we spend together. Listen, challenge stereotypes. Acknowledging our own privilege. Listening and not bystanding. In times when I don't know what to do about my situation that my friends have told me, I will talk to a professional so I don't say the wrong things.
Those are great. And I really do want to encourage people even, oh, somebody just put something in there. One more. Do you want to read it for us again?
Yeah. I remember the weekend everyone moved back to campus. Before we even started our spring semester, there was already a sexual assault case. One thing I will be doing is checking in with my friends because sexual assault is much more common than you would think. It is also so important to spread awareness and to make sure people know about available resources.
And then it looks like there's another one that says, do not be afraid to stand up for yourself and others. These are good. So I invite you all to, really, like when we write things down, we're more likely to hold ourselves accountable. So if you didn't put something in the chat, I would challenge you to maybe jot something down and think about it. Like think about one thing that you're going to do, because I promise you, you're going to encounter a microaggression, a comment about either sexual assault or gender-based violence or something that's racist, or a comment about the cases that are happening. If you're not told in person, you'll see it in your social media. We will absolutely have an opportunity to do something. And like Megan was saying, it can be small because small things matter and they do add up.
They do. And think about your life journey. If you do a small piece every day, what that collectively would be, for you as one individual.
Well, thank you. We will hand it over to the CE class to wrap us up here. Okay, well, or I can do it. So everybody, thank you so much for coming. I will hang out here in case anybody needs to touch base. Wanda, thank you for making time to be with us. Not only does Wanda join us here, and I have her on the radio station on the weekends on KPFA, she also was just on Anderson Cooper the other night. Congratulations for making your voice heard on a national platform. I really want to just take a minute to, this is our last formal program, although we'll, for this particular semester with Wanda, but I want to just take a minute to really underscore how much it means to all of us, Wanda, that you have been willing to come and be with us every month to talk about really important topics. And you feel like part of our community, and we appreciate that greatly. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I definitely enjoy being with all of the knowledge in this group and the wisdom that each of you have and the sharing that you have done. It helps me to, it encourages me, to dive in deeper, to really study, to really learn, to really read even more. And so I just, look forward to the day when I'm back in school working on my PhD. So I'm really grateful about it.
That's going to happen for sure.
It is definitely for sure. I don't know when, but I'm really gonna focus on going back and working on my PhD, and maybe one day becoming a professor.
I can
Who knows?
see that. You will have the most popular class. Can we please invite you all to turn on your screens and pop out so we can take a picture of everybody? We lost 2 out of the 30 that were here, but 28 is still good. Good number of people. Who wants to take a picture for us?
Do it.
Thanks, Ruhi.
Yeah.
I think you probably have a couple screens to get through.
Okay, I'm gonna do the first screen. 1, 2, 3. Okay, and then let me do the second one. Okay, 1, 2, 3. All right, got them.
Okay, and a special thank you also to the collaborators of this program and to the community engagement students who helped facilitate today. We really appreciate all of you.
Great job, everyone.
Thank you, Megan. Thanks for being here. We know that you have a lot going on too. It's a busy time. Oh, Megan, before you go, when is Take Back the Night?
Sure. So Take Back the Night is next Thursday, the 29th. You can go to our website to pre-register for the event. We'll have some spoken word and then a candlelight walk on campus.
And is the event, so part of it is on campus, and is there anything that's virtual or it's all on campus?
On our Instagram, we'll be having a virtual art walk, which will be shared imagery and other pieces of art, throughout the week.
Cool.
So that's an option as well. If you wanted to submit something, you could go to our website or attend the in-person event. So many options.
And the website being the CARE website?
Yeah.
Okay. So you can all look up St. Mary's College of California, CARE, and you can get there. All right, so we'll hang out, everybody, but you all can leave us or you can stay. It's up to you. We'll just be here in case people have extra questions.
Great, thank you so much to all of you.
Hey, Sharon, can I talk to you really quick?
Yes, but hang tight for a few
Okay.
minutes. We'll see if anybody else has anything. Let's see. Isan, did you have anything for us or did you?
No, I didn't.
Okay, thanks for coming.
Okay,
You're welcome.
I'll drop.
Bye, Wanda. I'll talk
Bye.
to you soon.
We'll talk.
Sounds
Thank
great.
you, Wanda.
You're welcome.
Okay, Dylan, you sent me an email today about your program. Is that right?
I did. I CC'd you. I basically took the emailing list that Jeff used 2 weeks ago, and I just sent the email to all the people he did.
Okay.
So I'm hoping that covers all the CE students from all the different groups.
Was there 36 names on it or something? 34?
Yeah.
That should be right.
And I did add Mason Lord to it.
Okay, perfect.